Okay, it looks like most people who are trying to join us have been able to enter. So I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Amanda and I work at Accounting for Nature. And with me today, I've got Declan, who works for Regen Soil, who's going to introduce the Landcare Level 3 method for soil. So if you're not familiar with Accounting for Nature, it's an environmental condition accounting framework which allows people to measure and report on the condition of various environmental assets. So we have a range of methods out there that people can use to take these measurements, which will convert the condition of the environment into a score that we call the econt score. Now, this is a score from 0 to 100, where 0 represents a completely degraded system and 100 represents the best on offer condition for that environmental asset. So the method that Declan will be introducing today uses that same conversion framework where you can communicate soil health to a wide range of audience using the score from 0 to 100. And so I'm going to hand over to you, Declan, to walk us through the method.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. I'll start by sharing my screen. I'm trying to bring up this slideshow. Yes, here we go. Oh dear. Okay, have you got the front page there, Amanda?
Yes, looking good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for your interest in the soils method. We call it the Landcare soils method because I was originally approached by Landcare Australia to develop up this method, and that's when the work started with Accounting for Nature. Just a little bit about myself firstly. So I'm the principal soil scientist with Regen Soils. This is a business that I established about 3 years ago. Previous to that, I worked for a New South Wales soil consultancy. I opened an office for them in Melbourne in 2014. And prior to that, I worked for the Victorian and Tasmanian state governments. So I've a wide range of experience with all matters of soil. I was just talking to Amanda about some projects that I'm doing between mine site rehabilitation, development of structural soils for urban development, and growing container media for new housing developments. But today we're going to be talking about the Accounting for Nature method S-02, the Landcare soils method. So the aim of the method, and this was part of the original brief with Landcare Australia, is to provide farmers with a scientifically sound and consistent approach to measuring, reporting, and verifying changes in soil condition over time. And the method establishes credible metrics to support investment in sustainable farming and natural capital. So work commenced on this in September 2020, and the method was formally accredited by Accounting for Nature in February 2021. And the intention always was to develop an accessible and user-friendly soil monitoring and evaluation method. So we elected for a level 3 method, which aims to have a confidence value of better than 80%. But a method that landholders were able to use to provide rapid feedback on changes in management, or even to identify parts of their aspects of the soil condition that were, if you like, letting the side down. So as Amanda mentioned, the Accounting for Nature model aims to establish, an index score for the environmental or ecological condition. I'm not sure if E is ecological or environmental, Amanda. Anyway, but because we're doing this for soils, and because the intention was to do this for soils on farms, we wanted to have a measure of the productive condition of soil as well. So these are going to be different and potentially in conflict. And the simple reason for that is that the original ecological condition of the soil pre-European clearing may have been really quite unsuitable for agricultural production because of pH or phosphorus levels, for example. So we have changed so much of our agricultural landscapes for our own needs, and that's primarily to grow exotic plants. So again, the focus on this method was to keep it very simple and accessible. So we elected a minimum number 5 of core soil health indicators. So these 5 indicators are soil acidification, so really a measure of pH, soil organic carbon, soil salinity, extractable phosphorus using the Olsen method, a measure of ground cover, and these indicators are aligned to the national matters for target. So the process that we go through is firstly to define the project area, and that's usually a farm or part of a farm. We need to compile existing soil data, and I'm kind of headlining these points, but the detail obviously is to be found in the method. We want to define the assessment units, and the assessment units are defined by soil type and land use, soil order and land use. We then want to develop a sampling plan. We need to determine reference values for both the ECOND and the PCOND, and the PCOND reference values are shown, and I'll talk about those a little bit more as we go through. And then, of course, we need to determine the indicator condition scores. So we'll talk about that going through as well. So this is just an example of some of the existing data sources that we may need to call upon to determine what is the soil order, what kind of soil type are we dealing with in a particular area. Now, a conversation I had earlier with Amanda about this highlighted the fact that there are some challenges around this, depending very much on the scale that we're operating on. So on very large farms, we might have a fairly high degree of consistency in soil across those areas. But if we're dealing with, like I'm based in Gippsland, we're dealing really with quite small farms. There might be, 20, 40, 100 hectares, but in a landscape scale, they're pretty small. And whether we have accurate, appropriately scaled soil data for these areas, it varies enormously right across the country. So in defining our assessment units, we're really just determining soil type and land use across the farm. So this is an example of one farm that we're currently working with Landcare Australia and Accounting for Nature to develop 6 accredited plans for 6 different farms in South Gippsland, and this is one of them. What this is showing here, the white outline is the footprint of the farm. For reasons of simplicity, I didn't exclude the farm building and outhouses, which are in this small section here in the top of the area. But basically, you can see pretty much all the rest of the farm are grazing paddocks. There's a few shelter belts and revegetation areas throughout the farm. There's a single soil type that dominates on this farm, which is shown in the lightly white shaded section of the farm, and that's a dermasol, which is a soil order under the Australian soil classification. And the area that's highlighted there in yellowy brown colour is a separate soil order called a hydrosol. A hydrosol is very similar to a dermasol typically, but what distinguishes a hydrosol is that it is seasonally inundated and that reduced environment of seasonal inundation creates principally physical and chemical differences in soil properties. So we have essentially 2 assessment units, therefore, on this farm. So the sampling plan that we've developed for this method is we're looking at 1 sample per 10 hectares up to 100 hectares, and over 100 hectares we have a minimum of 10 samples. Obviously, if landholders want to take more than 10 samples, they can, but they don't have to. And that's based again on the fact that some of those larger landholdings tend to have a limited number of soil orders across the farm. So we want to select transect areas in each of the assessment units per 10 hectare area. And we want that transect to be representative of that particular soil type and land use. So once we peg out that 100-meter transect and GPS points at the start and the finish, we want a soil sample at 10-meter intervals along that transect, which means we'll end up at the end of the transect with 11 subsamples, which we'll bulk together, and we'll draw off 300 grams for testing against the method. We want to observe ground cover as we go as well, and take a measure of estimated ground cover, but the method requires the use of aerial imagery, such as Veg Machine, but there's a number of other tools that we can use to monitor ground cover over the 12-month period, and that's the score that we want to assign to ground cover. So we want to determine reference values now to compare what results we get from the testing against. So the PECON reference values are essentially the production condition reference values. These are, I think, more straightforward because, if I'm growing wheat in Western Australia, or I'm growing wheat here in Victoria or in New South Wales or in Queensland, the requirements of a wheat crop are fairly standard across the nation. So we want pHs within optimal ranges, we want EC within optimal ranges, we want organic carbon to be optimized for the particular soil type and rainfall that we're in. We're obviously looking at ground cover in those environments as well, whether it's a cropping environment or a grazing environment, and we're looking at phosphorus as a single indicator of soil fertility. When it comes to determining reference values for econt, though, that's a little bit more challenging, because essentially what we're doing is saying, well, what was the original condition of this soil pre-European clearing in this area? Now, who knows what the pH or the EC or the organic carbon level was across many Australian landscapes, because they have been so completely altered since clearing, not only by the very act of clearing itself, but of course by subsequent land uses. And so much of the Australian landscape was tilled at some stage, even if that proved disastrous and it didn't happen again, or certainly it was grazed or otherwise managed for agricultural purposes. Really, we don't have very much soil chemical data, pre the 1960s. And even then, that's preciously little. So we need to go to relevant sources to help inform our estimation of what those original ecological condition values may have been. So there's a range of online tools that can help us in terms of helping us to identify the soil order that we're dealing with and understanding how they are likely to respond to agricultural management. But also we have the opportunity to look for historical records, intact natural areas that may have seen very little or no agricultural activity and extrapolate from those via expert opinion from soil scientists, agronomists, etc., what those original values may have been. Now, given how scarce that information is, there's probably dare I say, an over-reliance on expert interpretation of what those values may have been for a particular area. And that's where, getting input, particularly from local departments of agriculture, what's left of them, is going to be very useful, because that's where the kind of bulk of that knowledge is going to lie. So here's an example. VRO is Victorian Resources Online. It's a really good repository of what soil information we have here in Victoria. And there's been some very good mapping done, particularly in the south of the state. And this is just a snippet of one of those maps, the Warrigal soil sheet. And it's showing us what the dominant soil orders are in this particular part of South Gippsland. As I mentioned before, we want to use aerial imagery to capture ground cover, and this is a snapshot from spring 2022 for one of our sites in Moyara in South Gippsland, and this is giving us a measure of fractional ground cover. Now we're in the kind of nice position here in South Gippsland to be in one of the better watered parts of the country. So the results that we've gotten from our 6 trial farms have generally been pretty good for ground cover, particularly over the last few years when we've enjoyed La Nina conditions. So I mentioned before we have to come up with reference values by soil order. So this is just a snippet taken from the method that looks at, in this case, just organic carbon, but we have the same for pH, EC, phosphorus, and ground cover. The soil orders here will have slightly different target values based on the land use, the soil depth, the annual rainfall, and this column here is reference values for the econd, and TBD is to be determined, because that's going to be different really for every site that we look at. So many of these soil orders we can group together because there's not going to be a substantial difference in rainfall areas with these soils in terms of what a minimum soil value needs to be for the pecan. So bearing in mind these are agricultural soils with all the impacts that agricultural soils have suffered, particularly in terms of loss of soil carbon from tillage history and grazing management and other agricultural practices. The dermasols, the ferrosols, and the hydrosols can be expected to hold higher levels of soil carbon, principally because of expected higher clay contents and higher organic and the higher organic matter that we expect in these better watered soils. And depending on annual rainfall, there'll be higher or lower levels of minimum levels of organic carbon. And vertisols are in a class of their own here, and again, reflective of the expected very high clay content that we'll have in a ferrosol, in a vertisol, sorry. So what I'm showing you here now is the indicator condition scoring system that we've got for, again, just a couple of these soil properties. So I'm showing you the scoring system for pH on the left and the scoring system for organic carbon on the right. So for pH, we've defined what the reference value range needs to be for pH, and for agricultural soils, to give you a simple example, we've got a general range of between 5.5 and 7.5. And these are the kind of most commonly accepted values of acceptable levels of pH for a broad range of agricultural production. So bear in mind, we're necessarily a little bit imprecise with this method because it's got to apply to all of Australia, and hence the level 3 categorization as well. Now, the method acknowledges that there's going to be departures from these ranges depending on what is to be grown. And the examples that I give in the method are truffles or blueberries. So truffles will typically want a pH of greater than about 8.2, whereas blueberries will normally prefer a pH probably of 5.5 or lower. But for the vast majority of crops that we're growing and the soils that we're growing on, we're looking at pH values for, say, between 5.5 and 7.5. So we're looking then at deviations from that range. So if we're within that 5.5 to 7.5 from a agricultural productive point of view, for our pecan point of view, the score will be 100. If we're 0.5 above or below reference value, so if we've got a pH of 5 or we've got a pH of 8, then we're going to have an indicator condition score of 6. And you can see as we drop away in 0.5 pH increments from that target range, above or below, the scoring drops accordingly. So if we're more than 2 pH points above or below reference value range, which, in the case of productive soils is a pH of 3.5, quite unusual, but a pH of 9.5, also unusual, but probably a little bit more common than 3.5. That's going to get a score of 0. If we look at organic carbon over here, again, we talked about that with the previous example. Depending on the soil type and the rainfall, we have assigned our reference value ranges. We don't want to deviate too much from there because movements in soil carbon punches way above its weight, as you know. So smaller movements can have a big effect on system performance, not only plant performance, but how well the soil, how well soil performs. So 0.5% below the reference value range, so that's the minimum level that we're looking for. 0.5 to 0.5, 0.5 to 3/4, 3/4 to 1% below reference value. If we're more than 1% below the reference value range, we get a score of 0. So this again is highlighting the importance and trying to assign possibly a higher level of significance or importance to organic matter than we may previously have done. So this is the kind of model of spreadsheet that Accounting for Nature developed with a whole bunch of formulae built in behind to easily translate the value that we're getting to a score from when compared against the reference benchmark. So this example I'm showing you here is a worked example for an econd. And in this example, we're saying a dermisol in this area here has a minimum organic carbon level of about 5, which is going to equate to an organic matter level of about 8.5 in these soils. And again, that's reflective of the high rainfall and high clay content of these soils that we're typically finding in Gippsland. And so I should say, this is from one of our 6 farms that we're developing these plans on at the moment. Soil pH, and again, this is our estimate that soil pH ranged between 5 and 6 on dermisols in this area. Electrical conductivity is between 0.1 and 0.5. 0.5 is really on the high end, and we would not expect to see that, but we're making some allowance here for exceptional areas. Extractable phosphorus between 10 and 20 parts per million, and ground cover we would expect to be 100% in an undisturbed state. The values of testing are shown in this column here: tested value or average tested value. So the carbon score we got here was 4.9. the soil pH was 5.72, the electrical conductivity was 0.14, extractable phosphorus 22.11, and ground cover 92%. So that then is converted into the indicator condition score based on how far out of range these actual values are. And then we sum these values and average them to get our assessment unit econd. And because we've only got one assessment unit on this particular farm, it's all dermasol, it's all grazing, we have a single sub-asset score, and that's reflected there as 86. And these are, just popping up here, another example of the extractable phosphorus scoring method, where if we're less than 2 above or below the reference value range, we get a score of 80. If we're greater than 8 units above or below reference value range, we get a score of 0. This is another farm, that one that I showed you earlier, that has 2 assessment units on it. One, the main area is a dermasol and the smaller area is a hydrosol. And we went through the same system here, where we've got our benchmark values, the actual score that we got for those parts of the farm, and convert those into the assessment unit econd. It's just coincidental that they both happen to arrive at 96 here. Then they're weighted for the size of the area that's under each of the size of the assessment unit. So the dermasol occupied 90% of the farm and the hydrosol occupied 10% of the farm. So the weighting value is shown here, and then they're combined to give us an econd for the farm as a whole. And that's the same phosphorus scoring. And this is the pecond example for the first farm. And again, single soil order, all grazing. And for the pecond, we have a slightly different set of industry benchmarks, again, reflective of likely impact of agricultural activity over the years, but also changes in soil properties that make the soil more suited for our uses. So we've got a lower expectation on soil organic carbon because of agricultural disturbances and change of vegetation types. We've got generally an increase in soil pH, or a broader band of soil pH to suit the plants that we're growing. We have a higher tolerance for electrical conductivity because of perhaps the amount of fertilizer that we're using to grow our crops. We have a slightly higher level of extractable phosphorus for the same reason. And we have a lower expectation for the management of and maintenance of ground cover in agricultural soils. So again, these are the values that we scored on this farm. And when we compare them to our target values, we see that this farm is actually doing a pretty good job. So in terms of conventional farm management, they really are doing a very good job. This is a sheep dairy in southern Gippsland, and they have been paying considerable attention to soil quality for at least the last 6 or 7 years, and that's reflected in their scoring. And then the spreadsheet summarizes the data that we're looking at. And again, this is the sheep dairy summary results, where the econd, dermasol, grazing pastures, the scored, the overall acid score was 86 for the econd, and the overall acid score was 100 for the pecond. So actually, if I just take one step back here, or perhaps 2 steps back, where we have some scoring that is, the example here I'm just going to give you is ground cover. So when there's a score of less than 100, it points the landholder to where soil condition is being compromised. So similarly, if any of these values were to score less than 100, it highlights quite clearly the area that the farmer needs to pay attention to lift the overall score for the asset. And then these are mapped out visually as well as numerically to highlight performance. And then finally, resampling is recommended no sooner than 3 years. And this is really just simply because soils change slowly. If we were to resample, a year later, we might pick up, changes in ground cover quite quickly, and that, it may be a reflection of, whether we're in a La Nina or an El Nino, for example. But in terms of changes in organic carbon, we're just going to get a lot of noise. If we sample 12 months later, we could get a higher result. We could get a lower result. And that's based on the sampling intensity that we've employed in this level 3 method. So coming back no sooner than 3 years, and probably more appropriately 5 years for soil carbon, will give us more confidence in the result that we get if we see an increase or a decrease in any of those values. So we want to return to the original GPS transects. We want to resample at the same time of year, ideally with the same soil moisture, same soil temperature, for consistency of results. And then the resample data, as I said, can be used to provide feedback to the farmer and to refine management practices. Okay, so that is the method.
Thank you so much, Declan. And as I mentioned in the chat before, if you do have any questions for Declan, please pop them in the Q&A and we will go over them now. I also put a link in the chat to the method for anyone who's interested in downloading it and having a look. I thought we'd start with a question from David, who's asking what depth you sample to.
Oh, thank you. I should have said that. They're just 0 to 10 samples.
Thank you. And next is a question from Craig. So to summarize, they're in an area of high rainfall where the pH most of the time ranges between 5 to 5.5, which is considered pretty optimal for their area. And most of their non-limed agricultural soils are between 4.7 to 5. Does that mean that they will be penalized using the method, that they do have a lower pH in the region?
Well, the method is going to score them below those optimal targets. But there's a very elegant quote that I've taken from some former colleagues in Tasmania in relation to soil targets, which is repeated in the method. And it's really saying that the targets are just that, they're targets. Now, if you have a pH that's 4.5 or 4.7, depending on the clay content of your soil, you may be running the risk of aluminium toxicity in your soil. And that's why, as a general rule, we have a lower threshold of 5.5 as a pH for agriculturally productive soils, because below 5.5, and it depends very much on the soil, but below 5.5 is regarded as the tipping point at which aluminium begins to move into solution. And and it can move into solution quite quickly with reduction in pH below 5.5. If that's the case, that's going to have a significant impact on the productivity of the land, whether it's pasture or cereals or whatever you're growing. So the target is there to try and help optimize the production environment. We recognize that in some cases, particularly on broadacre, so if I'm growing cereals in Western Australia and I've got a pH of, that's below 5, and I haven't got an aluminium problem because I'm on sand, and I can grow a crop profitably and it'll break the bank if I try and bring my pH up to 5.5, that's fine. And this is really about giving feedback back to the landholder, and where there's a departure or from the method like that in the information statement. So if you were seeking to get your method accredited by Accounting for Nature, you develop an information statement, and that information statement will highlight why there's a departure from the particular target range with a justification in there. And that's really all that you need. Nobody is going to penalize you as such for that, but it explains why a particular value might score lower than you would like.
Thank you, Declan. And I thought I'd also mention two things related to that. One is that for the reference benchmarks, they are different for econ and pcon. So it's important to remember that you're talking about two different things. So the econ reference benchmarks represent what that would have looked like in an undisturbed condition. So it's less related to what's optimal for productivity. And so that pH range might be very different from what you want from a productive perspective. I also thought I'd mention something called condition targets, which is when you're looking at productive land under the Accounting for Nature framework, you can set a target for what the highest econ is that you think you can achieve, and that can take into consideration what resources you have available to improve it. So whilst 100 represents an optimal condition from an environmental aspect, that might not always be what you're striving towards if you are looking at also improving productivity. So the econ target that you set is dependent on your specific circumstances. So where you are, what resources you can allocate to improve the econ, and where you are starting to see trade-offs between econ and pcon. So you might not want to improve econ to the extent that it actually reduces your productivity. So you can set those targets to reflect what econ you can likely achieve in your area and what you want to strive towards.
Yeah.
So kind of relating to that question, we have one from Connor. And so he's asking about the reference value for econ, if it depends on where in Australia you are, and if that needs to be advised by an expert in the area. And so what type of information do you need to support to back that value up?
Yeah, and that's the thorny part, I think, of the method. As I was saying before, depending on where you are in Australia, there may be good or not so good soil data. Where there's not such good soil data, or where there hasn't been a lot of soil mapping done, we're going to have to extrapolate from information sources and from our knowledge of local soils, what condition these soils were likely in pre-European settlement, pre-land clearing, pre-modern farming. So that would be looking at understanding the history of farming in the local area. Was the land ever tilled, or was it always just, cleared and grazed? Was there ever anything added to it in the form of lime or the like to try and address productivity constraints? Has it ever been fertilized? So all of this information goes into, the black box, if you like. And this is where I think expert opinion will need to be called upon. And the first recommendation really is, for a landholder, is to go and talk to your local landcare people, because either they may be able to help you directly, or if they're not able to help you directly, they'll usually know where to look or who to ask. And typically, you'll be looking at departmental experts or experts from local academic institutions to provide some of that help if required.
Thank you. And so this is very specific to Queensland, but I found the Soils Department in Queensland to be of excellent help with asking for reference benchmarks. So we tell most landholders to go to them, because they can tell you what samples were taken nearby your property that represents what they call the undergraded condition. So it's a good free resource to use.
Yeah. Use it while it's still there.
Yeah, yes, exactly. That's a very good point. There are no more unanswered questions in the Q&A chat box. Might just give you a few seconds. Think, oh, there we go. One more question. So Mauricio is asking, how would you say the metrics support landowners to convince themselves to sustainable farming and invest in natural capital instead of business as usual?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. There's a fair bit of talk about natural capital these days, and I really welcome it, because I think what it's doing is it's helping, to my way of thinking, most farmers that I talk to say they want to leave the land in as good or better condition than they got it. But I really think we have lacked a kind of language or a common understanding of what that looks like and what that means in terms of how we manage our land. So when we're talking about natural capital, and when we're using a method like this and working with the likes of Accounting for Nature, that's giving us tools to start quantifying in a range of ways the health and consequently the value of our land. I often use the crude example of two farmers going into the bank saying, I want to borrow $1 million. And they can both show that they've got healthy bank accounts. But what's to say that one farmer has got that healthy bank account because he's ravaging his or her land, whilst the other farmer has got a good bank account because that person has really valued and invested in the natural capital of the land? Who is the bank going to lend the money to? So these are the kinds of tools that banks now and financial institutions are getting interested in, because finally they can understand, which farmer is more bankable. But also, I think, and more importantly, really, it gives information back to the farmer to say, I can leave the land in better condition, and I know how to measure that. I know what that's going to look like. And these, even though we've only got 5 measures in this method, they're cornerstone measures. And as I said, they're informed by a lot of work that's gone on nationally and internationally that has agreed on what these cornerstone indicators of soil health are. So if we can at least get the properties identified in this method right, we're a long way towards maintaining an acceptable level of soil condition. I've also developed a level 2 method for a private farming organization, which is a lot more rigorous than this one is. And there's nothing that says that a landholder can't go to a higher level of interrogation or a higher level of data to give them more information. But as a starting point, this level 3 method, by putting the cornerstones of soil health together, can give a landholder confidence that if they're scoring well against those measures, that the farm is in acceptable condition and hopefully getting better.
I think that's an excellent answer, Declan. And I think that's really it. It comes down to making informed management decisions about your land. But also, if you want to make any claims about the environmental condition on your property to consumers or financial institutions or whatever it might be, you need the data to underpin that, or we're seeing such a crackdown on greenwashing happening at the moment. So without that data, you will struggle to make those claims, especially going forward.
That's right. And also what it's trying to do is it's trying to make soil testing something that's kind of a little bit more accessible. An awful lot of farmers don't soil test for the very understandable reason that it's kind of complicated. Soil tests can be hard to read, and we're not entirely sure always what to do with results. And most soil tests, I have to say, are used to inform NP and K decisions. But there's an awful lot more information in soil tests that's of value and that gives us some information about the condition and the health of our soil, not just plant nutrients. So by having at least these cornerstones, it allows us to pull those out of a soil test result and say, okay, where do I sit? Do I sit in a healthy range, or do I sit in a range that I can do something about, that I can correct? Because too often I've seen soil test results that reflect business as usual, which might be a phosphorus application every year. So the phosphorus is up to here, but there's a whole bunch of elements that are deficient And all that phosphorus is just going to waste because the system is being held back by deficiencies in other elements. So we get the cornerstones right, and then we can start filling in the gaps from there.
I think that's an excellent way to wrap up the session for today. Thank you, Declan, so much for joining us. And to everyone here who might have missed a bit at the start, go and check out the method on our website. We will also be posting a recording of the session on YouTube. So if you missed out on anything, please feel free to visit our YouTube channel. It will be up there in a few days. So thank you all for taking your time to join, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.